where 34-year-old Darren Cole believed he had built the kind of life most people only hoped for. He worked long hours as an Uber driver, piecing together a modest income that allowed him and his wife, Melanie Carter, to live comfortably in a small rented home. They had met online 3 years earlier, after a series of late-night conversations about movies, food, and future dreams. Darren, once known for his restless, solitary lifestyle, had softened around her. Melanie was elegant, soft-spoken, and seemed to carry an air of mystery that fascinated him. Their wedding had been small, intimate, and perfect in his eyes. For 2 years, their marriage appeared calm from the outside, even happy. Neighbors saw them walking their dog every evening, sharing takeout on the porch, and laughing over small things. But beneath the still surface, something had begun to change. Darren had noticed small inconsistencies. Melanie avoided intimacy, postponed doctor visits, and became defensive whenever the topic of starting a family came up. She often spoke of female issues that needed medical attention but never let him accompany her to appointments. Still, he trusted her, convincing himself that every marriage had its private spaces. Everything unraveled one bright September morning when Melanie asked Darren for a ride to her gynecologist appointment. Her car had been in the shop for a week, and Darren, taking a break between rides, agreed to drop her off. The clinic was across town, inside a dull beige building surrounded by a quiet parking lot. Darren planned to wait in the car while she went in, scrolling through his phone and sipping coffee. After 20 minutes, Melanie texted that the appointment might take longer than expected. Bored, Darren decided to stretch his legs and stepped into the clinic to use the restroom. At the reception desk, he mentioned his wife's name, expecting to be directed toward the waiting area. Instead, the receptionist looked puzzled and typed for a moment before quietly saying there was no appointment under the name Melanie Carter. Thinking it was a simple mistake, Darren insisted she check again. The woman hesitated, then scribbled something on a slip of paper and handed it to him discreetly. It read, "Ask for Michael Carter." For a moment, Darren couldn't move. His pulse quickened, his palms dampened, and the air in the small lobby seemed to thicken. He left without saying a word, waiting in his car, his thoughts tangled between disbelief and dread. When Melanie finally emerged nearly an hour later, she appeared pale, avoiding his gaze, clutching a folder of medical forms tightly to her chest. The drive home was silent. Darren's mind raced through every memory, every small moment that now seemed strange in hindsight, the way she always changed clothes in private, her reluctance to be touched, her quiet panic whenever health discussions came up. That night, while she slept, he searched her purse and found an ID card bearing the name Michael Carter and the word "male." It was as if his world had split in half. The woman he loved was someone else entirely. And though the house remained still, a storm had begun to build inside Darren's heart, one that would soon destroy them both. The morning after discovering the hidden ID, Darren barely recognized himself in the mirror. His eyes were hollow, and his hands trembled as he tried to pour a cup of coffee. The smell made him sick. Every corner of the house felt different now. Every photograph, every item of clothing, every trace of her seemed false. He sat at the kitchen table staring at the wedding picture that once made him proud. Now all he could see was a stranger in a white dress, smiling beside a man who had no idea what truth stood next to him. Melanie moved quietly that morning, careful, almost sensing that something had shifted. She greeted him softly and acted as though nothing was wrong, as though the silence between them wasn't heavy with suspicion. Darren couldn't speak. He left the house, driving aimlessly through the streets, his mind a storm of disbelief and anger. He thought about confronting her, demanding an explanation, but the words refused to form. How could he even begin to ask why the person he married had lied about something so fundamental? He told himself there had to be a reason, a medical mistake, a legal error, anything but what the evidence suggested. That night, he went through the documents again, desperate for a different truth. Inside the folder he had found hidden beneath her clothes were medical forms showing years of hormone treatments, beginning long before they met. There were also surgical records, therapy notes, and a letter addressed to Michael, written by a doctor explaining post-operative care. His breath caught in his throat as the realization settled deeper. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. The woman he married had been born male, transitioned, and chosen not to tell him. He felt betrayed, humiliated, and exposed. The life he had proudly shown to others now felt like a cruel performance. When Melanie returned home that evening, Darren pretended to be asleep. He listened to her footsteps, the soft rustle of her clothes, the creak of the floorboards as she moved around the house, unaware that her secret was gone. He lay there, wide-eyed, his mind twisting through every scenario. Should he leave, tell the police, confront her family, or simply disappear? But with every thought, anger kept creeping in, louder and sharper. By the third day, Darren's behavior had changed enough that neighbors began to notice. He stopped driving for Uber and stayed home, pacing around like a trapped animal. Melanie grew quieter, spending hours locked in the guest room, whispering on the phone. Darren could hear fragments of her words, fear, apology, guilt, but never enough to piece together who she was speaking to. One evening, he watched her from the hallway as she sat by the window, crying silently. For a brief moment, pity stirred inside him. Then it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by resentment so deep it frightened him. He started drinking at night, staring at the wedding photo until the image blurred. On the fourth day, the tension finally broke. He told himself he needed the truth, needed to hear it from her mouth. But beneath that desire for answers burned something darker, something neither of them could escape once he decided to act. It was late in the evening when Darren finally spoke to Melanie. The sun had disappeared behind the line of trees outside their small kitchen window, and the house was filled with the kind of silence that made every sound seem louder. She was sitting at the table, scrolling through her phone, pretending to be calm though her hands trembled slightly. Darren stood by the counter, watching her, trying to steady his breathing. He told himself he only wanted to ask one question, to hear her admit the truth. But as he opened his mouth, the words came out broken, jagged with anger. Melanie froze, realizing instantly that he knew. The air between them turned heavy, charged with fear. She tried to explain, but he could barely listen. Each sentence felt like another blade twisting deeper into him. She spoke of her past, of the fear of rejection, of how she wanted to live as herself and believed he could never understand. Her voice cracked, tears running down her face, but Darren's mind was already gone, drowning in the weight of betrayal. He saw their wedding, the vows they made, the laughter, and it all felt like an elaborate joke at his expense. He slammed his fist against the counter, shouting words he could never take back. Melanie stood, backing away, her face pale and wet with tears. She said she had planned to tell him someday, that she wanted to believe love could survive truth. But all Darren could hear was the echo of his own rage. To him, everything in his life had suddenly become meaningless. The man who once loved her no longer existed, what remained was a storm of humiliation and confusion that twisted into something darker. The vase on the table caught his eye, heavy, decorative, something she'd chosen during one of their shopping trips. Without thinking, he grabbed it. The sound of glass shattering filled the kitchen, sharp and final. When the noise stopped, Darren stood motionless, his chest heaving, the weight of what he had done settling in slowly, like dust after an explosion. Melanie lay on the floor, her eyes wide open but unseeing. The room was a mess of glass, spilled water, and blood that crept across the tile in thin, dark lines. For a long time, he didn't move. He stared at her as if expecting her to wake up, to shout, to tell him this wasn't real. Then he sank to the floor, pressing his hands to his head, whispering words only he could hear. Outside, the neighborhood was still, unaware that everything inside the Cole house had just ended. Hours passed before anyone noticed. A neighbor walking her dog saw Darren sitting on the porch, covered in red, staring blankly at the sky. When police arrived, he didn't run or speak. He only muttered one thing over and over, as if it were the only explanation left in his mind. "She lied to me." The police lights painted the street in flashes of red and blue as officers led Darren away from the porch. He didn't resist, didn't cry, didn't ask what would happen next. His hands hung loosely at his sides, still stained from what he had done. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains, whispering among themselves, unable to believe that the quiet man who once helped them carry groceries had just been arrested for murder. Inside the house, detectives moved carefully through the small rooms, documenting every trace of violence. The overturned vase, the streaks of blood on the wall, the shattered glass scattered across the kitchen floor, it all told a story of sudden rage, not a planned act. Melanie's body lay covered beneath a white sheet, the silence around her heavy and final. At the police station, Darren sat in a gray interrogation room under harsh fluorescent light. He stared at the table, refusing to meet the detectives' eyes. When they asked him what had happened, his voice was flat, emotionless. He told them she had lied, that he had found out the truth, that he had just wanted to talk. His story was disjointed, slipping between shock and denial. He didn't claim to be innocent, he didn't even try to justify what he'd done. The officers exchanged looks, sensing that this was not a case of premeditated murder but a moment of uncontrolled fury. Still, the law did not care about emotion, it only cared about the result. And the result was death. The news broke within hours. By morning, every local channel was broadcasting the story. "Uber driver kills wife after shocking discovery," the headlines read. Photos of Darren and Melanie filled the screens, smiling wedding pictures that now looked eerie in the context of the crime. Online discussions erupted, dividing people across the country. Some expressed sympathy for Darren, arguing that deception had destroyed his sanity. Others mourned Melanie, saying no secret justified violence. Activists spoke about the dangers faced by transgender people, how fear and ignorance too often ended in tragedy. The small Omaha neighborhood became a place of reporters and camera crews, its quiet rhythm replaced by flashing lights and whispered interviews. Forensic teams confirmed the details quickly. Melanie Carter had indeed been born Michael Carter and had transitioned several years before meeting Darren. Medical records, therapy notes, and identification cards supported it all. There was no evidence that she had intended harm, only fear of rejection. Investigators pieced together the timeline of that final week, describing how Darren's discovery, isolation, and anger built toward the fatal moment. The prosecutor announced that Darren Cole would face charges of second-degree murder. In his cell, Darren spent his nights staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Sometimes he thought he heard her voice, soft and distant, repeating words from their vows. Other times he wished he could erase the moment he lifted the vase, freeze time before everything shattered. But time moved forward without mercy, dragging him toward judgment, leaving behind only silence and regret. The courtroom was packed on the first day of Darren Cole's trial. Journalists filled the benches, sketch artists captured his blank expression, and the quiet hum of whispered conversations echoed through the room. Darren sat beside his attorney, wearing a plain gray suit, his hair neatly combed but his face pale and hollow. Across from him sat Melanie's family, her mother, sister, and a few close friends. They avoided looking at him, clutching tissues, their grief still raw. The prosecutor spoke first, laying out the facts in cold, steady language. There was no dispute about what had happened. Darren had killed his wife during an argument inside their kitchen. The only question was why. The defense argued that Darren had been pushed beyond reason, that he had suffered a mental breakdown triggered by emotional shock and betrayal. The prosecution countered that deception did not justify violence. They described a man who allowed anger to replace judgment, who turned pain into murder. As witnesses took the stand, the story unfolded piece by piece. The medical documents Darren had found were presented as evidence. The receptionist from the clinic testified about the moment she mistakenly revealed the name Michael Carter. A neighbor described hearing shouting, then silence. The forensic examiner detailed the injuries, her voice calm and clinical as the courtroom fell into uneasy stillness. When it was Darren's turn to speak, the room seemed to hold its breath. His voice was low, unsteady. He admitted everything: how he felt betrayed, how he lost control, how he wished he could take it back. He said he hadn't meant to kill her, only to make her admit the truth. But his words did little to move the jury. To them, the image of Melanie's lifeless body was louder than any apology. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation: guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to 35 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20. As the sentence was read, Darren showed no reaction. He stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable, as if he had already accepted the weight of what was coming. Melanie's family wept quietly. Reporters rushed to the courthouse steps, broadcasting the story nationwide. Debate spread across social media, some calling the crime a tragedy of deceit, others labeling it a hate-driven act. Activists used the case to highlight the dangers faced by transgender individuals, arguing that silence and fear often came with deadly consequences. Years later, the house where it all happened remained empty, its windows boarded and lawn overgrown. Locals said no one stayed there for long. Some claimed to hear faint sounds at night: the clinking of glass, soft crying, the echo of a life cut short. In prison, Darren kept mostly to himself, refusing interviews and writing letters no one received. He once told a chaplain that he didn't fear dying, only remembering. And somewhere between guilt and memory, the story of Darren and Melanie Cole lingered: 2 lives bound by love, undone by secrets, and remembered only as another tragedy in the long, cold archive of American true crime.